Yes. Okay.
Awesome. Hi.
Hey guys.
Hi. How's it going?
Hi. Hey. It's
We're
been
back.
I know it's been like
Yay.
since February. um, we have obviously changed our format.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Um, just a little bit. Oh, there's the ice cream man. Yep, right on time. That's what I thought was going to happen.
Oh, I can't hear it. You're
Okay, good, because I can hear the ice cream man just fine. So anyway, so we changed our format because of, for obvious reasons, COVID, and we're not filming at the museum right now. So I was looking around and I was working with some other folks that were doing podcasting, and they actually did this the Gut Vocal, and I was like, or Get Vocal, and I was like, hey, I actually kind of like it. It's a very simple platform, so we'll probably be doing this for a while because there's a lot happening with the museum and a lot's in flux right now.
Can you talk
But
about that?
uh, oh, sure, yeah, I can start. Sure. So
Well, I mean,
so
you mentioned the museum. I didn't know if you were able to talk about those things yet.
Yeah. I mean, vaguely, yeah.
Okay.
So obviously, with COVID, we shut down for a few months, and reopened the end of May when the governor allowed low attendance, and the museum actually did a lot better than I was expecting, and we were able to do social distancing and the masks and stuff because the museum is so big. So we did get some help from the city government. They've been very generous with us, which is nice. But we're getting our feet back on the ground. It's still touch and go, and some weeks are pretty awful, and we have to be like, how are we going to pay the bills? But overall, we're managing. I haven't been able to bring everybody back, but we're managing to be open at least 7 days a week, minimally, as much as we can. And but what's happened over the course of the last 6-7 months now
Hmm.
is first of all, I was approached by a network representative with a production company who has been watching actually our podcast and some of the other things that I and the museum are doing. And well, in a nutshell, we got a 3-year contract for a reality show. I
So
can't
exciting.
say, I know, I can't say what the title is or when it's going to be released. All I can say is that primary filming has begun, and we don't know when it's going to be released. COVID has kind of slowed everything down because,
Hmm.
we can't have large crews and stuff. But they're developing the storyline and the story arc, actually, I'm sorry. And right now it's 3-year deal, and we will see where it goes from there. From what I understand, we are starting to get sponsors already, and so it's pretty great. And on the heels of that, in large part because of the reality show, actually, I just learned that preliminarily we will be moving the museum in the next 6 to 9 months.
Hmm.
We already know the location. I'm still kind of in shock about where we actually are moving to because it's just so amazing.
Can you
Uh,
share that, or is that still like
I can't. No,
hush
I
hush?
can't. No, that's still
Okay.
hush hush too. But I'm just in awe of the space that's we're moving to. It's beyond beautifully done and gorgeous, and a lot of it's already done. So
Oh, that'll be easy.
I'm yeah. I just am just so many amazing things are happening this year. It's just phenomenal. The staff and I are really excited. There was, some question as to whether or not we were all going to be cast for the show, but we were very big on the fact that we wanted to be as authentic as possible, and all of us that are on staff were cast for the show. And apparently, that was an option for a while, whether or not we were all going to be cast, or some of us were going to be replaced. So luckily that didn't happen,
Whoa.
and yeah, we were all cast,
Wow.
so that was great.
Okay.
But
That'll be exciting.
so that's
So you're going to be famous, maybe.
well, that's what the
Hopefully,
producer
fingers
keeps,
crossed.
yeah, like that's what the producer keeps telling me is like, be prepared, be prepared. You need to actually prepare for fame. We're going to have to replace
Hmm.
the entire crew once the show takes off, and because you're going to be busy doing public appearances and that kind of thing. And I'm I haven't wrapped my head around that part because fame is not
Hmm.
anything I've ever chased. So not on a big scale, and no, not even like on a small scale. I mean, I did horror movies for a while, but whatever, it was just fun. So so that's been 2020 for me anyway, and
Hmm.
I'm just trying to
Well,
stay
if
grounded.
I know most of the people that work there are female or identify as women. If you need man candy, I'm
Yeah, you
I'm
know what,
happy
you'd
to
be
be man
surprised.
candy.
The few folks that I've told, I mean, this is a bigger platform, obviously, but the few folks that I've told, especially the guys, every one of them has said, "Do you need a manservant?" And my question always is, what exactly does that entail in your mind?
Right,
So, is
of
that
course.
carrying my luggage, or is that, a lot more than that? So
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
most of them have been like, whatever you want. I'm like, oh, okay. So I haven't taken anyone up on their offer yet, but we'll see what happens as this unfolds. So anyway, so what's been up with you?
Nothing. I've been suffering like everyone else. I moved into a house the south side of Vegas, near Henderson,
Mm.
and now I'm teaching. So I'm one of the few people in my department actually teaching face-to-face classes.
Ah.
Um, we had the option. Actually, I just taught today, so I'm a little tired, but because my classes tend to be more performance than anything. Well, we'll say 60% 70% stand-up comedy, um, actual 30% content for the most part.
To keep the students entertained.
Yeah, the best I can. But I bombed today. It was so bad. I teach a 101 and they were just so quiet. They didn't say anything. And I'm
Oh
like,
no.
these jokes are golden. These are you would kill, but
Oh
they
no.
weren't having it. And then my sexuality class, I don't know, they just didn't seem like they were having it today either. So
Uh,
it happens. My Monday classes were more responsive. They were more fun.
that's
But
good.
I'm not saying my Wednesday classes aren't fun. It's just today they were quiet.
Right, right, right.
You know, can't pit them against each other. Plus, they might actually listen to this. Who knows?
Right.
Um, yeah. No, things are all right. I'm not really playing roller derby right now. Moving. I've been doing a lot of weightlifting, strongman. I'm thinking about moving into strongman competitions.
Yeah.
Um, because I'm big and it seems to help.
Ah.
Um, yeah. So I've just been lifting weights and trying to stay healthy. I did get COVID.
Yes,
That's
you
fun.
yeah, you did. You did get
Yeah.
COVID.
Over the summer.
Yeah. Well, you weren't
And
exactly isolating yourself. I mean, come on.
true, true. I put a lot of emphasis on my health of like, I'll be fine. And I was. I was only sick for a couple days. I had a cough linger for maybe a few other days after that. But the fever and the chills and the aches and all that only lasted a couple days. And then I was more or less fine. The only thing that's really stuck with me is the anosmia. Like it's kind of coming back finally.
Yeah.
Um,
And for
and
those
it's
people that
really
don't know what
weird.
that is,
Yeah, that's your loss of smell and
right.
taste.
Right.
So they're connected. So that was something I've been handling, sort of.
Right.
But it comes back in weird ways.
Mhm.
Um, like some of my gym stuff, like I wear knee sleeves whenever I do heavy weight, like squats and deadlifts and stuff.
Mm.
They smell so bad.
Ah.
But the moment I was able to smell them again, like I didn't realize how bad they smelled. And like one day I just got this whiff of them and I'm like, oh my God, that's awful. And I'm like, oh my God, I can smell it. Like it was just so exciting. Yeah, it's little things like that. But I'm like, I can smell again. So,
Do you know
and
who
I, and
you
I kind
got
of,
it from or whether or not you passed it on to anyone?
my roommates got it. I have two roommates, but actually only one of them got symptoms, the same symptoms as I did.
Uh,
So,
uh,
um, yeah,
uh,
and he was only sick for a couple days too, and his wife actually, so his partner, she sleeps next to him, and she never had any symptoms at all.
yeah, I've heard that
So,
that women seem to be they are affected less by
hmm,
COVID than men are. Yeah. Which
that's
worries
interesting. I
me
hadn't heard
because
that.
I like take testosterone, and so I'm just kind of
Mhm.
like, well, what does that exactly mean for me?
Right.
Someone that has higher than normal testosterone levels as a woman. So weird, huh? Well, I'm glad that everyone was okay.
Yeah, but I will say, I always tell people that whenever we get in these debates about COVID, I will tell you that it felt different. I've had the flu, I've had strep throat, I've had upper respiratory infections and stuff like that. I even had bronchitis once, from allergy, like severe allergies to mold. So I'm familiar with having issues with this part of my body.
Hmm.
It felt weird. It just felt fundamentally different.
Uh,
Like, I'm like, I can see why this would cause some people problems,
uh-huh.
that they weren't healthy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The aches, the pains, the weird, like you're tired. The
Uh.
the fatigue is really bad. Um,
Have you checked to see if you have any inflammation of the heart? Because I hear that's like a silent, lingering kind of thing.
not that I've seen. I mean, I go to the gym regularly,
Uh,
so I feel like that would have slowed me
Well, I
down a
think that's
little bit.
something more
But
they'd have to determine, like in an MRI or something. Like,
is it?
I hear that a lot of asymptomatic people have like lingering inflammation of the heart. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So,
No, not that
okay,
I know of, but
right,
I haven't had that checked either. So,
right. Yeah, I haven't had COVID. I have been very, very isolated. You know, I go to work and come home, and at work we're behind um the shields, and we wear masks and stuff, and I have a copper laced mask or lined mask, so and it goes from like here all the way under to here, and I wear that everywhere I go, and I tend to
yeah.
not do too much. But I was following some of the research on keeping your immune system up, and so I got an MMR booster back in the summer, and then just got my flu shot like about a month ago and stuff. So I'm trying to at
Mhm.
least keep my immune system primed in the event.
Sure.
But I'm hoping that I'm gonna be I'll be lining up for one of the first rounds of vaccine, and I'll just take my chances because I have heart problems, and so I don't, I'm not ready to croak yet. So, but
Mhm.
I have to be really careful, especially, and I have an elderly mother who has blood clotting issues, so I have to just be really careful. So,
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not really around at-risk people very much,
mm,
so that helps.
right,
Um, but I hear you. I definitely hear you on that.
yeah,
It
so
is scary, and I take vitamins, and I
yeah,
drink a lot of water and do stuff like that.
yeah. I started taking vitamin D too.
Hmm.
Or several like medical professionals who are saying that actually does help, so to reduce the
Yeah.
symptoms and everything. So it's and the thing is like I have a degree. I have a master's in public health, so I'm always kind of looking at the public health aspect of things, and really all I did was I sort of the kind of attitude that I have towards STI prevention and STI awareness and testing and that kind of stuff that I do anyway. I just kind of shifted it over to COVID, and for me, it wasn't really a big shift, in behavior at all. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and being semi quarantined, I'm kind of an introvert anyway, so there was only one person that I was actually spending any time with, um, a someone that I've been spending time with for many months actually, and he's also being super careful and quarantining a lot and working from home and stuff like that, and we even took a break for a little while, just when the cases started to really explode. We just said, look, let's take a little bit of time off. So, but yeah, it's been not really a big change, but I'm looking
Hmm.
forward to it's kind of like I'm looking forward to the option of being around a group of people. Not having the option feels a little weird. Even if it's, oh, I want to go hang out with those people, but I think I'll stay home in bed. I don't the option's not there, so that's a little weird.
Right.
Um, and we had to like close the show, the puppetry show at the museum, and that's been closed since March. We might
Hmm.
open it up now that the governor has raised the amount of people that can gather. I have my concerns about that, and so do the performers, because it still is an enclosed space. So,
Hmm.
but we'll see. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't want to. I want to mention this, but I don't. Just a few minutes. Last night we had the first presidential debate.
Oh, yes, we did. Yeah, we did.
Oh
Yep.
my God.
I I had work that I had to do, and I came home a little early to accomplish that work, and
Mhm.
and I had gone to work around 8, so I was, by 6 o'clock I was ready to move on to. But I spent the hour before the debate like restless, pacing my house, just really anticipating what this was gonna be like, because like a lot of people said that, with Trump trailing, that if he didn't pull it off, that the likelihood that he was going to be able to, you know, change the voting patterns is almost nil. And I
Mhm.
was reading this morning that some of the folks inside the White House that were like talking to reporters outside anonymously were just like, not only did we not pull ahead, but we lost a bunch of people last
Oh,
night.
I believe it.
And I was
Absolutely.
like, and that's coming from inside the White House. So, yeah.
I watched the whole most of the and it was awful. There was a couple moments of gaff. I don't know if they were gaffes or they were meant to be said, but so I coming from Indiana, um, we have and a lot of people have this, sense of family, right? And that's a lot of what the Republicans build on, family values and things like that,
They picked the wrong president for that.
right? And the moment Trump started going after Biden's now dead son,
Mm.
I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah, yeah.
What do you like?
Yep.
And for me, for Biden, he was trying to like talk his way out of it. And
Yep.
I'm like, Biden could have swept that whole thing if he just looked at Trump and said, "Don't you ever fucking mention my son again."
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
just like that is a no-go.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't get to, or actually, like, and I'm sure a lot of people felt this way too, or, from where they're from, it'd be like, that's a chin check to me.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah. Well,
like
and then
that that
what I was impressed with Biden is he could have very easily brought up any one of the Trump kids and their attachment to foundations that misused funds that were
mhm.
supposed to go to cancer treatment for children, and he didn't. He
And he
did
didn't.
not go
Right.
after any of their kids. He stayed
Which is
with Trump's performance and what
right.
he wants to do. You know what? I have spent more time than I care to ever acknowledge with malignant narcissists when they argue, and
Hmm.
I have lost it because of frustration and just I couldn't anymore. And Biden spent 90 minutes not losing his cool. And for me,
Yeah,
him
I don't.
telling Trump to shut up was not losing his cool. It was just like,
Mm-mm.
really? You know, uh,
Yeah, but
yeah.
the way he talks, Trump talks. I was talking about this with my roommates, in that he he's from New York. People from the East Coast like that, they interrupt each other. That's how they talk. You
This
have to
wasn't
talk
this
louder
wasn't New
and
York.
faster.
That's not New York. That
You
was
don't
not New
think
York.
so? You don't think that
No,
was New
nope,
York?
nope. That was not New York. No, and
Hmm.
I say that as someone who interrupts a lot. And I kind of blame that my slash half East Coast, half German upbringing. That is not that is not no, that is classic malignant narcissist. That because it
Oh
wasn't
well.
just interrupting, he was like malignant narcissists have this unique conversational style. They call it conversational narcissism, and they weave this story where they're the victim and they're perpetrating all in the same breath, right? So while he's claiming victimhood, he keeps victimhood, the superiority, and then attacking. And he was doing it so fast. That is not New York. No. Not for my,
that's
no.
True.
As far as I'm concerned, that's not New York. No.
Okay. I was just thinking the interrupting. Context makes more sense for sure. Or the content of what he's saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and there's a difference between interrupting and talking over for the purposes of domination. Mm-hmm. And that's what Trump was doing. And I was trying to keep an open mind as much as I despise Trump, but he didn't make a case for American people. All he did was brag about himself, and then in the same breath say what a victim he is. That's it. He didn't address American people once. Biden addressed the American people several times. Like even I, who really don't fall prey to groupthink or anything like that, I felt seen and heard. He's just like, look, I'm going to do this because you could tell that Biden is a person of service. Trump is not a person of service. Trump is there for personal enrichment, period.
Yeah.
And it was obvious. And even like hardline Trumpsters were just like, I can't vote for this man this time. I just can't. That was not presidential. That was just him being a spoiled bully.
Yeah. I want to see, there was the call for having Joe Rogan moderate one of the debates. I think that needs to happen. Chris Wallace did his best. He tried to be as nice as possible. But I think in that scenario, you're going to have somebody with a little more backbone that's going to call somebody out, regardless of their station.
Chris Wallace did call him out.
Yeah, but he was still timid
like, hey,
about it.
You have been talking over Biden more. He actually called him out.
Yes. But he still continued to do it. I feel like Joe Rogan would be like, all right, turn his fucking mic off.
Oh, well, yeah, and no, somebody has to have a mic shut off button. Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
But, at the same time, though, and this is where Biden, I think, was really strong, is he wasn't letting it affect him too much. He was just like, you know what, I'm not going to listen to this clown. I'm just going to keep talking and talk to the American people and talk about policy and stuff. And he really didn't get shook too much by it. There was sort of a confidence there that I think turning off Trump's mic would have denied people the ability to see him perform as poorly as he did. So my 2 cents. True. I don't know. That's my opinion. Take it or leave it. Yeah. Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. Oh, yeah, we're supposed to say that. Like and subscribe. Our channel. We're on Twitter. Sex Nerd Podcast on Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah. Now this isn't going to be edited like our other stuff. This actually just is recorded the way that it is, and it's then broadcast the way that it is. Right. So, like I said, the platform's a lot different. But speaking of people's behavior. So what
are we talking about?
What are we talking about? So we were talking about
and Trump to a certain extent. Like he ties in this.
Yeah. Well, because you're right. Yeah. So give us a synopsis here.
So I thought of the other day. So I was reading part of my sexuality class. We talked about sexuality formation, sexual identity formation, right? And along with that too is this notion of orientation.
Yeah.
And how that gets started. And, in the press right now, the QAnon, I think that's how you say it. QAnon, whatever.
Yeah. It's one of these conspiracy theory movements. Yeah.
Right. It's a right-wing conspiracy theory movement. They're the people behind Pizzagate.
Okay.
Right. So they believe that there's this tight group of satanic, I think they call it a cabal, a satanic or cabal of Satan worshipers who kind of run the country or run a bunch of shit, and they all have, they're all pedophiles.
They're not Illuminati?
Right, they're Illuminati.
Okay.
It's Illuminati.
Well, and I remember that they had serious consequences. There was the one pizza place that they actually said was happening. There was a shooting.
Right, Pizzagate. The guys, one of their followers or guy
Yeah.
watching all this showed up at this pizza place because I guess it was owned or somehow connected to Hillary Clinton, and
I think
he
she
showed up
she went and visited once or something. I don't even know.
something,
Yeah.
and he showed up with a gun and either shot up the place or was attempting to, and the police got involved. There's actually a video of his arrest where he's
Oh.
talking about that he thinks that there's a pedophile ring in like the basement or behind the scenes of this pizza shop. That's the Pizzagate thing. Yeah, it's so far fetched. Yeah, so it's like this group of Satan worshippers, that all have sex with children,
Oh
and
my God. And we've
yeah,
been
that's
hearing
the
about
foundation.
the what satanic panic since the 80s at least.
Right, right.
Yeah. But this is
Around
worse.
Dungeons and Dragons too.
Oh yeah.
Jesus.
Marilyn
If
Manson. Oh
anybody
yeah,
actually,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, if anybody actually watched kids play Dungeons and Dragons, they'd be like,
It's
"The
all
fuck?"
I played it. I played it as a young adult, and I played it with
Hmm.
my kids, and we're all dorks.
Yeah, like there's
And
no
we
there's
make
no
up
Satan
things like
worshiping going
fairies
on.
and stuff, you know.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, but yeah, so that's where a lot of this stems from because now there's movements of Save Our Children, which is impacting how we can view human trafficking,
Oh,
because it's this conspiracy theory around and like inflation and misdirection of human trafficking statistics. And then, of course, the new hashtag of kill all pedophiles that
oh,
popped up. Um,
oh.
yeah. So I think there's a misunderstanding. I'm not saying
Amongst conspiracy theorists, I don't think they see it as
maybe,
just a
I don't
misunderstanding.
know. But and a lot of this stems from the movement from academia of these things being viewed as sexual orientations, right? There's a lot
Oh,
of pushback of the idea of pedophilia,
mhm,
particularly pedophilia, as in sexual orientation or
right.
sexual identity.
Yeah.
Um, and I thought we could stem that to zoosexuality as well, or
Mm.
zoophilia,
Or
and then
necrophilia.
also and necrophilia as well. I
Mm.
think that those three are pretty heavily taboo topics that we
Mm.
could address or kind of formulate this notion of sexual identity
Mm.
around them.
Mm. Well, so
Almighty.
there are two prominent names that are actually colleagues of ours,
Uh-huh.
either closely or loosely, um, who have done research into this, both, I believe, from a neuroscientific perspective and a sexological perspective, or maybe even a psychiatric perspective. I'm not sure about the latter.
Mm-hmm.
But two names come to mind. So the first one, of course, is Cantor, Dr. Cantor.
Right.
He seems to be, at least, in terms of my exposure, one of the more, or even the most vocal. And then, of course, there's Michael Seto.
Or
Who
Cedo
also
or Seto.
Seto,
I
yeah,
haven't met him yet, so I don't.
right.
Right.
Um,
Who actually wrote a paper called "Is Pedophilia a Sexual Orientation?"
uh, okay.
Um, yeah.
Seto
So that
or Cantor?
Seto.
Seto, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, so I did a little bit of research and I came across a paper written by J. Paul Fedorov, who is, let's see, a professor at, you know what? I'm not seeing it right off the top of my head. Anyway, he published a paper in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law on the law. And it was actually just published in June of this year.
Hmm.
And he takes on and Cantor's reasoning in terms of this. And he makes sure to point out in this paper that that he has frequent conversations with both people, that both
Mm-hmm.
Cantor and Seto, and that they consider themselves colleagues who are just trying to pick this apart and figure it out.
Right. So let's
Yeah.
Before we dive into Fedor's Fedorov, right? Fedorov's piece.
Hang on, I don't want to screw it up. Fedorov, yeah.
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 So Seto, I know well. I don't know Cantor's work. Seto, I know he frames it, and I think we can jump into this. So Seto's work is that he compares it to just sexual orientation in general.
Mm,
So if we're talking straight, we'll use pedophilia because that was his the reading I know, or the paper I know.
mhm,
And he breaks it down into these three different categories, like age of onset, um, sexual and romantic behavior, and then
mhm,
stability over time. And he shows
mhm,
how, much like other sexual orientations, follow these things. Like, it gets started early. There's the notion of sexual and romantic connection together towards the focus of your attraction,
mhm,
right? And
mhm,
then stability over time, meaning that, even though you might try to change it, it's still going to be there. And he
mm,
shows how in those cases, even with pedophiles, that they experience that same thing. It's an early
mhm,
onset. They
mhm,
believe that they a lot believe they have a romantic connection with
mhm,
their focus of interest,
mhm.
and then it stays with them. Like, even if they do behavior modification and things like that, it's still there.
Right.
So it's almost
Well,
as if
we
they're.
find that in necrophilia too. Some of the research that I did, and some of my colleagues that have looked into necrophilia too, the age of
Mhm.
onset of attraction to either death or corpses or what have you is anywhere between like 6 and 12.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow.
And it stays fixed. It's fixed.
Um,
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's fixed. And the same
Hmm.
thing for zoosexuals, or zoophiles.
Hmm.
One of the big researchers, Dr. Hanny Maletsky, I think that's how you
Okay.
pronounce her name, Maletsky. She was at the institute, I believe. Maybe I'm pretty
Your
sure she
institute
got
or my institute?
your institute.
Oh, okay.
Um, I think she did some research there or some work there. But
Mm.
she actually wrote a piece too, in 2018. So Seto's piece came out in 2016.
Okay.
And she wrote a piece in 2017, basically looking at his work and how it relates to zoosexuality. And she
Hmm.
found the same thing. People that report, having sex with animals, it's around, they find their interests early,
Hmm.
between 8 and 12.
Hmm.
That's for men and women.
Yeah.
And that it's something a lot of
Right.
them
Right.
believe they have a romantic connection or some sort of, loving connection with their animals. And, it's something that they enjoy doing. It's not something that changes. So
Hmm.
it's pretty stagnant. So those templates, those three main components from Seto or Ceto are really what we're looking at as like
Mm.
foundations of orientation. And
Right.
I think, and I always give my students this statement,
Mm.
and I think it's important when we're going forward talking about this stuff. So anybody who's listening, anyone who's like, this is fucking bullshit, children can't consent, blah, 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 and, animals can't consent. It's not about the focus. You're getting wrapped up. I think people get wrapped up too much on the focus of their sexual interests.
Mm.
It's
Well,
not
we're not
about
talking
children.
about
It's
consent. We're not talking about
right.
consent here.
Right.
Okay.
We're not talking about really children or animals or their sexuality. We're talking about the
Right.
people who have that. And
Yeah.
oftentimes I use this as my argument or to get them to understand. We've all found people attractive,
Mm.
right? You've all found people sexually attractive. You might even
Hmm.
look across the room and be like, I want to have sex with this person, unless you're,
Hmm.
demisexual or something like that. But
Right.
even still, I would say there's always that component of like sexual attraction.
Hmm.
Did you ever ask their permission to be sexually attracted to them?
No, and the thing is no, it's whenever like I don't think any of us ask if we can be attracted to someone. We just are. I know for me,
You just are, right?
it's like that. It's not anything I can control. I'm just like I'm attracted. Like I've sometimes equated it to chemistry, right? I
Hmm.
don't think about it. It's just there, and it doesn't necessarily require a conversation in advance, right? It's just like
Right.
boom, it's there. And I think
And
that's the case for most people. Now, there are,
right, and
of
I
course, those that claim that, well, they require an emotional connection to actually be attracted to someone, and that's okay. But
sure.
at least for I think a majority of people, attraction is something that just happens.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And that's where people get lost in the weeds when we talk about these non-normative sexual practices.
Yeah.
Is that they get wrapped up in the consent or the sexual autonomy of the focus of the identity or attraction, as
Well, and I think
opposed
there's a little
to
bit of
the
a
individual.
go ahead. Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a little crossover at what you're pointing out, and the conversation that's happening right now in the queer and the LGBT community, which is, can people be attracted to genitals? Right. So, and a lot of them are saying, well, if you're attracted to a woman with a penis, you're discriminating against a woman with a penis, and you are transphobic. And it's kind of like, well, the science at least shows that that it's more likely people are simply attracted because they're attracted. Are there social cultural aspects? Well, of course, but attraction is a fundamental reaction to something that most people don't control.
Right.
So
It's
that argument of transphobia because you're, not attracted to someone that has a certain set of genitals.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
agree. I
so
think
attraction's kind of just a core raw thing.
right. And I think for when we're talking about these non-normative sexual identities, people have a hard time thinking about them as orientations because they're stuck on the focus, the not the focus, but
The consent?
target of their the attraction. They're
Okay.
focused too much on the sexual autonomy of children and animals, and even we'll say dead bodies as well. They're focused on that rather than trying to understand it as a sexuality from the perspective of someone who has the attraction, and trying to get them to flip gears and be like, well, have you ever asked for permission to be attracted to someone? And
Right.
most of the time they say no. Well, that's dumb. Exactly, that's my point. You're focused too much on the target. Think about the person. So going forward, when we think about these things, like for those people listening, like you gotta look past the target. I know it's tough and you want to protect all children and blah 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 and morality. I get it. But at a certain point, like if we're gonna look at this from an academic perspective, that's I think the view you have to take.
Yeah. And I mean, there are, and Cantor points this out, that there are many what he calls virtuous pedophiles who don't want to harm a child. They're mortified by their sexual orientation or their sexual, their target focus, and they don't want to act on it, and they work very hard not to. And we can't make the leap that someone is a pedophile, therefore they're automatically going to harm. That was the same argument that was trying to be made with necrophiles, is those who are necrophiles want to kill, and that's not the case at all. Like paraphilic necrophiles, for them it's a paraphilia, and the ones that are purely paraphilic and don't have sort of a blend of that and a cluster B personality disorder, they want consenting partners to role play. It's more of in a BDSM realm, right? So we can't assume that just because someone is a necrophile or a pedophile or a zoophile that they want to offend.
Right.
We can't assume that.
Right. So, right. I think that's a great point. That assumption is often what drives people's opinion of them. They have a hard time seeing them outside of the law, outside of the legality of the behavior. It's like, well, this is behavior. Why would you want to engage in that behavior? I don't know. I fucking speed all the time. I know they're not the same caliber, but you get the idea. Also, it's not necessarily about the behavior, too. Just as you're saying, it's not always about the behavior. It's about their sense of self, their sense of identity, and who they are, and knowing that about themselves. You mentioned the virtuous pedophiles. Yeah, a lot of pedophiles who identify as pedophiles don't offend because they know it's wrong.
Right.
And so
I had a personal experience with someone who self-identified as a pedophile, and my son at the time was like 3. And I can't remember how I met him. I think he lived in the apartment complex that I managed at the time. And I was, at that point still even interested in pursuing a career in what I ended up doing. And I spent a lot of time with him, like asking him questions like how, why and how and so forth. And I'm not going to share when he became aware of it because that's personal and I don't have his consent for that. I haven't seen him in like 25 years. So I don't know if he's even alive at this point, but how he used to deal with his pedophilic interests was art. He drew art to get his frustrations out and to sort of communicate what it represented to him emotionally. And I remember we had known each other for about a year, and he shared with me that because he was in his mid 30s at this point, and he shared with me that he had already made plans for suicide if he felt that he would ever not be able to stop himself before he offended. And that he had, I guess his father was a physician or something, a chemist or something, and that he had a cyanide pill that was accessible and that he would take it if he got to the point where he was heading out the door to offend against a child. Yep.
Wow.
That was already planned. He was already planning it. And he said there's going to come a point where even role play, for me anyway, he was concerned would not be enough anymore. And that's when he had planned on taking his own life.
Yeah. So you do see a lot of internalized stigma, internalized social control, internalized aspects of this. And I think also what's important for people to understand is how sexual identities get formed. I think from a lot of, we often think of sexual identity as being innate, the born this way analogy, right? Or framework. And while that is one argument, and that may be the case, I think it goes along with what you were talking about earlier, is like that innate attraction. You have the innate attraction, and then what manifests outside of that. So the whole notion of identity as a pedophile, right, or a zoosexual, or a necrophiliac or necrophile, like gets formed in society. Because remember, our notions of, we'll go back to pedophilia, our notions of childhood are relatively new, of what a child is, like adolescence particularly, being like post-pubescent childhood is relatively new. A, we didn't used to live that way. And B, once you were hit puberty, like you were kind of an adult, or shortly after that, you were seen as an adult.
You had girls having babies at 13.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't do that now.
They didn't see that past 30. They died by the time they were 30.
Exactly. Yeah. So our conceptualization of those years has changed gradually, or not gradually, but drastically in just a few hundred years.
Yeah.
With medicine, people living longer and, things like that. So, and with that, you have the formations of these identities based on things that have changed in society. 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, someone who was 20 having sex with a 12, 13-year-old was not pedophilia.
No, it's true.
Actually, the word pedophilia didn't even exist.
Well, the word pedophilia doesn't apply to that. I think that's already into hebephilia at that point.
Right. And I think that's a distinction too that not a lot of people know. So
yeah. No, pedophilia doesn't cover all the way till the age of 18. There's hebephilia, and I think hebephilia is defined as anyone that's attracted to someone over the age of 12 or 13, I think.
It's like post-pubescent or
yeah.
Pubescent. Or pubescent.
Yeah, not prepubescent. Yeah, pubescent.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's pubescent on, and then, but it's like to a certain age now. It's like what, 18, I guess,
no,
or
I think
legal
it's
age.
17.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, okay. It's 13 to 17, or 13 to 17, I think.
Yeah.
So I want to take a look at I don't know that I'm a little hesitant to lay the weight of sexual orientation on society and social systems, only because in a lot of the research that we're seeing, the social impact was the shame that came from the realization of having a certain orientation. Now, are you saying that that also forms the orientation?
Yeah. Well, not the
Okay.
shame, but the societal image of it. So we've talked about this.
So it makes
So
it taboo?
sort of.
Okay.
Look at homosexuality. Homosexuality was a mental disorder, or technically until what, 1974?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to look at it chronologically. As science and medicine gets started,
Mm-hmm.
you have sin to sickness, right? So these non-normative, heterosexuality technically was labeled as sickness because it was sex for the sake of pleasure with a member of the opposite sex
Oh.
originally.
Oh.
Yeah, so then it diverges,
Okay.
and it's shame. But homosexuality is the same for the sake of pleasure with a member of the same sex. And
Sure.
then, but it's a behavior. It's just a
Yeah.
behavior that can be modified until it becomes a type of person.
Okay.
And so it goes from sin to sickness to type of person. And of course, whenever you're identified as a particular type of person,
Uh,
one of the first things you're going to go do, especially if it's stigmatized type of person, or stigmatized behavior,
mm.
you're going to go find people like you. You don't think there are, but you're going to find that. And homosexuals did that. They went, to Boys Town in
Yeah, they went to the
Chicago and
gay
the
bars and
Castro.
stuff. Yeah,
They
yeah,
were the
yeah.
gay parts of town, and they found community. And through
Right.
community, they developed identities. They
Well, and
developed
that's the
who
same
they
thing with
were.
necrophiles too online. They have online communities.
Absolutely,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing more and more now today with the internet is
Mm-hmm.
this path is you have sin sickness, type of person, community, identity formation, and then oftentimes there's political action. So
Mm-hmm.
trying to get recognition,
Mm-hmm.
right? You see it, BDSM did the same thing.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know
Sin sickness.
necessarily know that BDSM has a strong political influence on our mainstream culture.
But there,
Neither
I
do
say political
swingers.
act, right? But I say political action in relationship to just like getting recognition, being seen as legitimate,
Oh.
right? BDSM went through their legitimate phase. I feel like after 50 Shades of Grey, it was all about, no, we're not about sex. It's not about sex. It's about community and play and
Well, that's because 50 Shades of
blah,
Grey
blah,
was such a
blah.
poor example of any kind of BDSM. I mean, there was rampant
It was.
violation of boundaries and lack of consent and stuff. It was a poor
Hmm.
representation anyway. So, if
Absolutely.
for no other reason, they had to speak up and go, no. But, well, let me get back to what you're talking about with the identity formation. And I want to read a little bit from this paper where Fedorov actually kind of goes into at least Cantor's arguments.
Hmm.
And it's just a paragraph. Somebody later said pedophilia, in parentheses, persistent sexual interest in children is a paraphilia. Cantor argues it is reasonable to deem homosexuality a paraphilia if there are enough, in quotes, correlates and associated features of homosexuality with those of the acknowledged paraphilias. In contrast to Bailey and colleagues, Cantor chose to define homosexuality as predominant sexual interest in persons of the same sex, including interest in adults and children of the same sex. Cantor reviews similarities between people who identify as homosexual and people with paraphilic interests. He compares the two groups on several factors: onset and course. He claims these factors are similar. Fraternal birth order, gay men on average have more older brothers. Short height, mixed results. Non-right-handedness, more for gay men. Decreased intelligence, more for pedohemophilic men. And what he refers to as neuroanatomic studies. In other words, structural MRI demonstrating non-overlapping sets of anatomy. Cantor acknowledges that correlation does not prove causation, but nonetheless argues that the failure to find similar correlations between homosexual orientation and paraphilic interests suggests the existing data seem more consistent with the conclusion that homosexuality is a characteristic distinct from the paraphilias. So that's an interesting approach to that question.
Hmm.
Now, Fedorov challenges that. And let's see. He argues that this is problematic reasoning on Cantor's behalf. And he breaks it down, and I can get into that a little bit later. But
No, go ahead. What does he say? Why is?
well, I can get into it later, just because I have to. I'm looking for it.
Oh, okay.
Right. So hearing that, what is your perspective on Cantor's argument with regard to the question of paraphilia, and that it more aligns with a homosexual identity than a paraphilia, or like similarly to a homosexual identity rather than a paraphilia?
So admittedly, I struggle with the notion of paraphilias to begin with, and I think you know that. I don't like the
I don't know that I
categorization.
do. I don't know that I did, actually.
Yeah, I really, because that's actually what pushed me away from psychology into sociology, is because we don't identify paraphilias.
Okay.
I think it's almost like it's an axiomatic perspective, so a foundational perspective on how you see sexuality. And for me, psychology, I know a lot of psychologists, and they're great people, and they would probably argue the opposite. But their field, them as individuals may be different, but their field is really still hoping they discover normal sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're going to look under some rock someday and they're going to find it. It's
Yeah,
this foundational, like, positivist truth of like human sexuality. And Kinsey was trying to get at that the only true sexuality is variation.
yeah.
That's
And sexology has the same perspective. In sexology, it's even, I would argue, even less stigmatizing, in that from a sexological perspective, identities and sexual orientations and sexual preferences are what they are. And if they are problematic, how do we manage them effectively to reduce suffering, right? So there's a complete lack of moralistic judgment. Having said that, as someone who studied necrophilia, it's difficult to get away from categorization or classification, because there are variations within those categories. There are variations within necrophilia, and I'm sure there are variations within hebephilia and pedophilia and zoophilia. At least in necrophilia, when we were writing our theoretical paper on the various subtypes of necrophilia, the list was potentially endless. We actually had to stop because there were so many variants in that. And I think that's where, and part of that was criminality and so forth. So I think it's difficult to separate ourselves. As much as sexologically speaking, we want to be non-judgmental, just the very necessity of classification, unfortunately, lends itself to stigmatization. And it's a problem that I think we're still struggling with, at least in sexology.
Yeah, because in classification, Foucault argues this, that authority is derived from the ability to define others.
Right.
And we give that power to people. We give that power to experts to define us. And in
sexological research, or as a sexologist, that it's what do you call it? It's a cognitive type of dissonance. We're bumping up into our own philosophies, are bumping up into our need to classify it. It's tough. Yeah.
Right. So
well, let's I actually found it. So let's look at what Fedorov had to say about Cantor's approach.
Yeah.
So he says Cantor's approach to the question is unique. He compares items correlated with paraphilias and items correlated with homosexuality, and decides that because there are few, if any, common published correlations, they most likely are different. This is like observing that because black cats are more often associated with superstitious anxieties than white cats, they likely are different things. Or conversely, comparing a cat with a rock and deciding that because they both fall to the ground at the same rate if dropped, they likely are the same thing. This is treacherous reasoning. It is important to remember that even if homosexuality, however it is defined, were shown to correlate with pedophilia, it would not mean one causes the other or that they are the same. For example, height correlates with weight, but height and weight are clearly not the same thing, and one does not cause the other. Ironically, the main item that Cantor claims to be similar between homosexuality and the paraphilias, namely their onset and course, is arguably not true. Most people are aware of their gender and orientation before they become aware of their sexual interests, and Cantor's claim that paraphilias are immutable has been debated elsewhere. So that was it. Yeah.
Yeah.
His response to that really, like, especially this notion of the paraphilias, whether or not they're immutable. But he makes some really, really good arguments about this idea that when he talks about they're aware of their gender and orientation before they become aware of their sexual interests, that's some of what's being shown in the research. People who responded at least to the necrophilia research knew their gender and their orientation way before they knew what their sexual interests were. Those sexual interests came about years later. Like I said, most kids know that they're a boy, girl, or whatever way before those particular sexual interests that they have, which come after 6, after 8, after 12.
Mm-hmm.
And
but arguably,
so I thought his response to that was interesting. That Fedorov's response to that was interesting.
Is it? So then I would challenge, just from a sociological perspective here, on gender, is that they're socialized into those gender expressions and gender orientations. Now,
are you arguing that children they're a blank slate? Because Money already did that with disastrous results.
Money didn't know what the fuck he was doing. I say that with the utmost respect.
I don't think gender is purely socially influenced.
I don't.
Is that what you're arguing?
No, I don't believe that either. But things that not 100%, but I think there's elements of gender that are socially constructed and
ascribed. Pink clothes and blue clothes,
right, and then also behaviors and things like that. We often stifle a lot of, even to the point of the children. Have you ever seen the studies on touch of babies?
Well, I know that they fail to thrive if they're denied touch.
No, this is girl babies are touched or handled more delicately than boy babies.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
I believe that though.
Yeah. So that impacts your development. That impacts your growth. So that would be a social component to that development. Now, I do believe that hormones play a role in our behaviors.
A lot of stuff in utero plays absolutely a role.
Yeah. 100%.
And they've even done studies where they've seen like homosexual men have similar sized brain structures as cis women, and also the same with lesbian women and straight men. But
it's also cultural too. If you go to different countries and look at how gay men act, they don't all act effeminate. There's a wide variety of how gay men act.
But that's true cross-culturally. You see that in American culture and everywhere else. Like there are some gay men you would never know are gay.
Right. So
and some who are very very obvious.
Right. So then how does that play out as far as gender then? So what you're saying, because this is where this gets conflated, tricky, is it like all men have similar brains as women? Wouldn't they all act feminine like women? Granted, not all women act feminine, but they would have the propensity for it.
Well, they can't say all. It's just
right. So
more
if it is a right. So if we're grounding this in biology, having a biological component to these gender expressions, then you would see them more times than not. And the variety is really what's kicking there. I think it's more of like, maybe you have like a computer, right? You have the groundwork set, and then these other things trigger it.
Well, it sounds like you're predicating that statement on the idea that brain structures are all going to be either one way or the other, and we see variance in that too.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. And in hormone levels and so forth and so on.
Right, but there would be if we're going to ground this in biology, we have to find like vast statistical similarities.
And I don't have the data with me to be able to do that.
Yeah, I don't either.
I didn't get those aren't the studies that I brought to this conversation.
Right. So when we're looking at gender and we're looking at these things, like I do think there's a social component to it.
Of
I, I
course.
love I love Deborah So, and I know what she was trying to get at, but her descriptions of what made her masculine were socially constructed things. Like I do karate and like do these things, or she did jujitsu or some martial arts or something like that. We ascribe those things as masculine behaviors. So they're not inherently masculine. We ascribe
No,
them to be
right.
masculine.
And I can
So
even attest to that as someone who takes testosterone. My behaviors have changed to be considered more socially masculine, but I, I, again, these are constructed.
right,
Labeling a behavior is constructed by society. Now,
right.
does that
So
mean it's
when
not based in some kind of biological fact that over time we've seen certain behaviors that are innate to genders, or it's the chicken and the egg kind of thing?
mhm,
Mm-hmm.
right, and
Right.
this is the ongoing argument between sociology and psychology, I believe, and
Yeah.
medicine,
Yeah. Medicine.
and
Right.
yeah, and I think so when we take this back to things like homosexuality and pedophilia, those
Mm-hmm.
things, orientations,
Mm-hmm.
because what is Fedorov arguing that he doesn't see the same foundations of orientation or in pedophiles that you would in homosexuals
Well,
or gay folks.
right. So, uh, Fedorov is suggesting 5 distinct aspects of sexuality that have different levels of mutability: genetics, gender, drive, orientation, and sexual interest. And I could read each one of these paragraphs, but he has I'm sorry. Yeah, genetics. I added that.
So when you say mutability, can you kind of what does he mean by that? I mean,
Okay. Well, then I'll read on. A major determinant of sexuality is genetic makeup. People with XX chromosomes are female, and people with XY are male. While genetic variations occur and gene expression can be altered, karyotypes are immutable. Importantly, this does not mean that genetic diseases cannot be treated so that their natural course cannot be altered. In other words, like, for example, diabetes can be treated with insulin and diet. Gender identity refers to a person's sense of male, female, or third gender. GI is generally established by age 3. While the concept of a critical period for the establishment of GI has been disputed, it is generally accepted that GI, once established, is resistant to change. In contrast, gender role, which refers to how people choose to present themselves to society, is modifiable by cultural and subcultural expectations. Sex drive refers to how much a person subjectively wants to engage in sexual activities. It is a factor that is highly changeable and can be influenced by a host of elements, including physiological factors like hormones, psychological factors like guilt, shame, or well-being, education, situation, religious expectations, and sexual history and opportunity or lack thereof. 2 more. Orientation. This factor is defined by the genders and may bring about strong feelings of affection, limerence, or love. Notably, orientation is not defined by genetics, gender, or drive. It is possible for men to have sex with men without being gay. Similarly, it is possible for gay men to continue to identify as being gay, even if they do not engage in sex or have no sex drive. Importantly, although lesbian women typically seek sex with women, gay men typically seek sex with men, bisexual people typically seek sex with both men and women, and people with heterosexual orientations typically seek sex with opposite sex partners. In no case is orientation dependent on the gender of the person's sexual partners. Given that orientation is defined by gender of affection, there is no reason to pathologize any of many possible variations of orientation, and the APA was correct, though slow, to remove homosexuality from the DSM. Concerning mutability, there is evidence that the orientation of women is more changeable than the orientation of men. And lastly, sexual interest. This factor refers to what a person finds sexually arousing. Again, it is important to note that sexual interest is not defined by any of the other listed factors. For example, pedophilia is defined by a sexual interest in children. A clinician who walks to the reception room to meet for the first time with a patient who has pedophilia will not know if the patient will have a genetic condition, will be male, female, or intersex, or will be a person who identifies as gay, straight, or bisexual. The mutability of sexual interest has been disputed and is discussed in the next section, and we can always go into that, or we can link it into the.
So again, I don't mean to cut you off there.
Yeah.
What does he mean by immutability?
Well, immutability would mean that it's unchangeable.
Okay. So nothing can modify it. You can't stifle it, right?
If you're talking about pedophilia, I think that's what he's arguing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's what he's arguing, I don't see how he's countering what Cantor is saying. If he's saying
Um,
that, is he saying that pedophilia is not an orientation because an orientation has to do with gender? He's basically arguing against an age orientation. He's arguing against because it's about.
well, I think he's adding a different perspective to Seto and Cantor, where it comes to Cantor seems to be arguing, well, it's similar to homosexuality, and Fedorov is going, okay, no, it's more in depth than just that,
Mhm.
right? So I don't think he's arguing that pedophilia is mutable. I think he's arguing that it's in order to be defined, it's you have to take it apart greater than say Cantor did and equating it with homosexuality.
Mhm.
Is like what I'm getting from his writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I feel like that, yeah,
So
I would agree with that. Yeah,
yeah.
so I was confused. I thought he was saying it wasn't an orientation. I thought that he was just
No, well,
countering what Sneto and Cantor were saying.
he's offering another perspective. He didn't say he's debunking their perspectives. He's saying he's offering another way of looking at it.
Gotcha.
Right.
Yeah, so it just makes it more complex.
Right. And I still come back to that I'm still challenged by the orientation thing, and it could just be because of this conflict that sexology has between non-judgmentalism and the desire to classify. So I might be stuck there, and I admit that. I'll admit that.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I think
just because there are so many subcategories, you have necrophilia. Like for me, doing research in necrophilia, you have necrophilia here, and then you have 150,000 variations of how that expresses
like,
itself.
can you give me an example? Like, what do you mean by variation?
Okay, sure. So, for instance, in our paper, we found, and I don't know if I have it here with me.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you what, you keep talking. I'm going to look for my paper because I don't want to misquote anything.
Well, I just want one example, like one or two examples of what you mean by variation within necrophilia. Like,
Okay, hang on.
is it they prefer women or they prefer men who are dead? Is that what you mean? Or
no. Like I said, I gotta. Okay, well, a good example would be, and we term them certain ways, but you have, say, the Ted Bundy-esque kind of necrophile who goes into these altered states when he is committing certain kinds of violence against bodies, right? So he was particularly violent with these bodies, and he would describe his reaction to that would be to go into this kind of altered state where everything shut off, and it was this height, this super high that he would reach when he would say dismember a body or mutilate it. Okay, and then you have other types of necrophiles whose arousal is basically thinking about a loved one giving their life to them as a gift, and that's an expression of love.
Yeah.
Right. And so those are the different ways in which necrophilia can express. And there are like many, many more, but there's different ways in which this expresses himself. And and so classification therefore becomes important. And I would guess, I've never studied paraphilia in depth at all, but I would guess that pedophilia has its own unique ways of expressing itself from person to person as well.
I'm sure it does. And I think there's an element of comorbidity with a lot of this. Just as you're describing the Ted Bundy situation, it wasn't the necrophilia that drove him.
No,
it was all these other things.
He was a classic cluster B and all kinds of other stuff. Yeah.
Right. So, and it sounds like with the other one too, it's not necessarily the necrophilia. It's not the act. It's all the stuff around the act. And so
likely, yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we get wrapped up in, and this is my issue with categorization, these behaviors as paraphilias. Well, a lot of them,
Okay.
like we've deemed them illegal because of especially with pedophilia, it's traumatizing, right, to
Of
children.
course,
Even
yeah.
though
Well,
the
there's
Ryan
laws.
study,
I think Art
yeah, that
Schwarzenegger put like a law out in California that the defiling of a body is illegal,
yeah.
and
So
that
we have a
serves that.
legality to it,
Yeah, it's a
but
legality, and the thing is the corpse itself isn't can't consent or reject. It's the feelings of the family that comes into play, and rightfully so. Rightfully so.
sure,
Yeah.
right. But if we're talking about the sexual orientation of the individual,
Uh huh.
or this notion of being, so it's a behavior,
Right.
again, that is illegal. A lot of people see it as a sin or sickness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would just argue that people engage in this behavior and they've been labeled the type of person. I think that's been the issue, is that we've now labeled pedophiles, labeled necrophiliacs,
Yeah.
labeled zoophiles. Um, and so we've demanded that they be this type of person, as opposed to it being a behavior. Now it's a type of person, and with that we've now basically set in motion the creation of identity.
Mm. Because
Uh,
classification in and of itself isn't necessarily a negative. I think I would argue that's how it's used as the negative. Because classification is just a means by which to observe nature and to break it up into its parts. I don't think there's anything inherently. I mean, would we stigmatize the classification of stars or planets or how they behave
yeah, but
in
I
the
think
cosmos? Is it just
yeah, but
uniquely human, and that's why we're stigmatizing it?
yeah, but we don't put that in a book called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manuals of Mental Disorders.
I guess
Like,
that's true.
it's categorized in a book of mental
Yeah,
disorders.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So, like, inherently, it has a weight to it now.
Right.
If it were
And
just like
right.
behaviors,
Yeah.
like, here's a list of behaviors,
Yeah.
absolutely, sure.
Yeah.
But that's not where it is.
No, and I think what's his name? One of my favorite scholars. He's a part of the organization I'm with. I don't know, I'll get the name, but he argues that paraphilia should be removed from the DSM completely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I would
Uh,
agree with that.
yeah. And he makes some good arguments as to why. Like I said, let me look it up.
Mhm.
Who I'm talking about, because I've actually met with him on several occasions, and I'm embarrassed that I can't remember his name because I've sent him emails on multiple occasions. Right, Charles Moser. Charles Moser.
Yeah, Moser.
Yeah, Moser is a prolific writer about paraphilias, and he argues pretty convincingly that they should be removed from the DSM entirely.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. But then again, there's some that maybe need to be categorized
Mm-hmm.
as damaging. But then again, you have the Rhine study. So going back to pedophilia, you have the Rhine study that came out in what, the 80s or 90s,
Mm-hmm.
that was a meta analysis of all these studies that looked at contributing factors to trauma, later trauma from adult child sexual relationships.
Okay.
You know, and it was condemned by Congress. It was like the first and only study condemned by Congress because it didn't fit the narrative. And there's been a lot of stuff to look that, like, tried to debunk it, or that has critiqued its study methods and things like that.
Which is
Um,
fair.
yeah, which is what science is all about.
Yeah.
But the Vine study showed that when it comes to or pedophilia, the there are the contributing factors to trauma for trauma in later life, um, isn't necessarily the behavior. It's violence associated with the behavior, relationship to the person who is the perpetrator,
Mm-hmm.
like how closely related you are to them,
Mm-hmm.
and then the reaction of the people around you was a big component. The reaction of your environment. So, like, because and then also gender played a role in relationship, like who the gender was of the perpetrator and the individual. Like, a lot of young boys were who were perpetrating women, or offended with women didn't really have that negative of an experience later in
Well,
life.
and interestingly, we have a exhibit up at the museum that I really didn't want to put up, but the owner of the museum was like, just give it a shot and see how people react to it. And it's a long hallway of female perpetrators.
Right.
And I
The
talk about
student.
grooming and so forth in that
Mhm.
exhibit. But the reactions, we've kept it up this whole time. I don't know if it's going to make it to the new space, but the reactions have been interesting in that primarily heterosexual cis men, one of their major questions is, well, where were these women when I was 12 and 13?
Mhm.
And the reaction from largely heterosexual cis women is, what's wrong with these women? They could get adult men. They're all attractive.
Mhm.
Um, but it was
Yeah,
interesting to
it's not
me
about the.
but that's generational. That reaction is mostly from boomers and Gen X. Once you start getting
Mhm.
into millennials and Gen Z, that changes. That attitude
How so?
changes. They start commenting about being victims
Huh.
of female perpetrators in their youth.
Yeah.
That
So the
dynamic has
narrative has
shifted. The
changed.
narrative has shifted. Yeah, whereas
Wow.
the older Gen X and boomers, have sort of more of a nonchalant attitude about it. It's just like, well,
Mhm.
where, especially the cis hetero men,
Yeah.
which has been
I mean,
interesting to
South
watch.
Park. Yeah, South Park had an episode like that where
Oh,
uh, I think it's Kyle's younger brother who's like a toddler or something like that gets in a relationship with the teacher,
oh
and
yeah, I
when
remember
people,
that one.
yeah, and people will find out, they're like, nice,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
the reaction to it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. I don't know the take home. Well, the take home is essentially like we can say this, I think, as an orientation
Mm.
based on what Seto was saying. Sounds like what Federer is saying too, and Cantor. Um, there's a lot of arguments against it. I think a lot of the arguments stem from the the ickiness of it, the ick factor. I think it's the legal factor, the ick factor, the um, focusing on the target as opposed to the individual who has the orientation or the inkling, if
Mm.
you will. Um, which I get. I
Right.
get where they're coming from. What's up,
Yeah, of
Falcor?
course. That's Falcor. Yeah, she's been sleeping
Yeah,
next to me.
yeah. So,
Yeah, I get it. I get it. But I think uh, those factors, the ick factor, and all that stuff that you just commented on, makes it difficult for these folks to get treatment, right? Because they're afraid.
mm,
And Cantor also, I think he's often mentioned things like um, dolls, real dolls and so forth that
yeah,
are formed to look like children, and whether or not that would be effective in averting perpetrating against real children and so forth, and how various governments are blocking these dolls, and without even like trying to see if there would be a positive effect of having them be available to people who are oriented this way.
hmm,
So well, and then I think there's an automatic leap to, they're a pedophile, they should go to jail. Even if they've never
right.
offended, they're a pedophile, they should go to jail. And I think that's primarily what people are arguing, like Cantor and so forth, is this isn't to make an excuse for people to harm children. It's to get treatment for these
Absolutely.
folks so that they're not in the shadows, um, not only just not suffering, but also trying to get them mental health access
Hmm.
to mental health services and so forth.
Yeah. Or, I mean, one of the side arguments would be, is there help that's actually going to work? Have we
Right,
found the model? Have we found the mental health model that's going to help?
right.
Um, and I think if we ground this in like that biological component, doesn't sound like there is because it's innate.
Mm,
So you'd have to do like genetic modification or epigenetic modification somehow.
right. Yeah, yeah.
So it gets tricky,
It's tricky.
100%.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, there's perpetrating, and then there's, whether you want to call it paraphilia or orientation. Those are separate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's ultimately the point to recognize when you're talking about QAnon and these trafficking things and so forth. There's perpetrating, and there's
Right.
paraphilia or sexual interest or orientation, or however we're going to define it as we go forward. Those are
Mm-hmm.
separate. We found
Right.
that in necrophilia, we found that in zoophilia, and I believe the same can be said. And like I said, I don't study pedophilia at all, but I would guess that the same would apply to pedophilia and hebephilia as well.
I would make the argument too. I would even stretch that to if we're talking about sexual identity.
Mm.
We always talk about especially community formation and then the identity. There's this changing of terms, right? So zoophiles are not zoophiles; they identify as zoosexuals.
Okay.
Um,
Or there's
I don't know.
people with necrophilia instead of necrophiliacs, right?
Right.
Right.
And then I've heard the term intergenerational sexuality or age orientation as
Okay.
opposed to pedophilia or hebephilia.
Right.
Um, and I think if we're looking at that like identity framework versus the trafficking framework, I would say that the people being trafficked are not being trafficked to pedophiles. The people being trafficked are being trafficked to people who have money and want to do something taboo. They want the opportunity. I think there's probably a lot more comorbidity between the people who are being trafficked for, uh, you know, these quote unquote pedophile rings.
Right.
There's probably a lot more going on, and they probably don't identify as pedophiles. People who identify as pedophiles don't hang out in rings, and I'm speculating for this is conjecture 100%.
Sure.
But someone who actually internalizes this and identifies as a pedophile probably isn't going to operate so out loud like that.
I don't think so. I
Yeah,
think just from a social perspective, they would hide.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we're dealing with is
Yeah.
something vastly more, I don't know, class based or like I said, some comorbidity of narcissism or
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure. I feel like that's your avenue better than
Yeah. Yeah.
mine. Like the
Yeah. It's
type of
more about
person,
perpetrating against someone than it is about what they're doing. It's just that they
yeah,
can, right?
yeah,
It's a lack of empathy
sure. I,
and a
I would
sense of
agree with that.
entitlement. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
And then natural identity,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that people
100%.
that have the sexual interest of children as a paraphilia or identity, or however we're going to term that as we go forward, is uh, there's a difference again between that and perpetrating. And I would argue that,
Perfect.
like, yeah, and I think that people would perpetrate against the vulnerable regardless of the vulnerable, right? Whether it's a woman who is living alone and has children she's raising, or it's a child who is vulnerable, or whatever. Like, I think they like to perpetrate
Hmm.
against the vulnerable. It make
Yeah,
it to follow up with your statement is it's about who they can perpetrate against, not necessarily what that vulnerable person is defined as.
yeah, I agree. What they can get away with.
What they can get away with.
Like, who was the rock star? There was a singer of a band, like a semi-popular rock band, and he was dating this woman, and then him and her got in trouble, or maybe it was just him because he wanted pictures of her daughter or something like that, or was trying to like groom his way into having sex with their daughter or something. I don't remember.
I don't
I'm sure I
know.
can find it,
Yeah, I don't know.
but that's one of those situations. He had a relationship with this woman. He had a physical relationship with this woman,
Hmm.
but wanted to see what he could get away with. Wanted to
Hmm.
expand, like, I'm sure there was a lot of other issues going on up in his noggin that
Right.
weren't pedophilia, but just,
And that's where we go back to cluster B disorders. That's,
yeah.
perpetrators tend, and I would argue, Dr. Lee Malore would probably have way more knowledge on this than I do because he actually studies perpetrators, where I study people that more see necrophilia as a BDSM aspect of their sex life. Um,
Hmm.
it's they have this, lack of empathy, and will go to any means to get access to those who are vulnerable.
Yeah.
And sometimes they will keep the act up for years.
Mm-hmm.
Grooming is a thing that they're slow and methodical, and that I think also plays a role into what we see in cluster B disorders is they are goal-oriented, they are slow, methodical, and excellent actors who are motivated for their own power, pleasure, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and coupled with a lack of empathy, Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
By any means necessary is their attitude.
Yes.
And, if we're talking about like narcissistic personality disorder, there are other scholars out there on the internet that talk very eloquently about the nuances of how it manifests itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But so, yeah, I'll link this paper from Fedorov, and there's links to it. There are
I'll link
the
I'll
references
send you
to the other papers and stuff, so I could put that on the YouTube channel too.
Oh, does it link to Seto's piece, Seto's thing? Okay.
Yeah.
And then
it links to some of Seto's work, whether or not it's the same as what you said is pedophilia sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it links to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And then for those who are interested in the zoophile lady, Hanny Miletsky, I believe.
Okay.
I forgot what university she's at, but she has studied zoosexuals and zoophiles.
Mm-hmm.
And the article is zoophile or zoophilia, another maybe look at orientation or something like that, sexual orientation. So basically, it's doing what Seto's doing and what these guys are doing, but just with zoophiles, zoosexuals. It's the same idea.
So, see that link, and I'll put it in the description on the YouTube channel.
Okay. I think my link was through the university, so they wouldn't be able to see it anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So we're supposed to do this: hit subscribe and like, and share it with other people. Yeah. We do have a Twitter page. I believe it's Sex Nerd Podcast.
Yep.
Sex Nerd Podcast.
Yep.
And of course, we have the YouTube, and then we also have a website. Hopefully, as these go on, maybe we can move on to a couple other places, which would be rad. So we're going to keep building.
Yep.
And but the more you like, and the more subscribe you do.
Yes. No, I've talked to Wednesday Martin, and I've talked to Lee Malore, and I've asked them if they would be on the podcast because we have 4 squares here to talk about the nature of ethical versus consensual non-monogamy, and Wednesday's argument that neither apply, that they actually do a disservice to the non-monogamous communities and make room for violence and for predatory people, and that she argues that it should be called disclosed non-monogamy. And then we're also going to talk about how those on the radical left and in woke culture use the consensual / ethical non-monogamy as a power play in those communities to gain access to sexual partners with nefarious ulterior motives.
That would be fun.
The statement "disclosed non-monogamy" removes the arrogance from the declaration of whether or not you are a non-monogamous person. It doesn't create a one up or one down.
My monogamy is more ethical than your non-monogamy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's consent. It's not ethical. You can't define the argument. Yeah. So I asked them if they would be interested in being on the podcast. They both said yes. We just have to pick a date. And I'm going to be on Wednesday's podcast that she has with, oh God, I'm embarrassed now. I can't remember who her co-host is, but I'll put that in the description as well. I'm going to be on their podcast.
No, Wednesday, Martin, and yeah.
Oops. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to Wednesday's co-host. I'm sorry. But I'll put it in the description. Yeah. So
Awesome.
Whitney,
Okay.
it's Whitney.
There it is.
Yeah, Whitney and Wednesday's podcast. Yeah. So yeah, I remembered. But I think it would be a great conversation to have. Lee takes a very Lee is very much an advocate of free speech, even if it pisses you the F off. He's not delicate, and that's one of the things I like about him is that his opinions are unfiltered, and he navigates them being challenged really well. Actually, I've been on a couple of his podcasts, and I've challenged him a few things, and he's like, "Well, let's dive into that." So, and I like those kind of conversations because he doesn't immediately go into rhetoric. He actually is open-minded enough to do that, and I get that same impression from Wednesday as well. Especially if she's challenging existing narratives anyway. Anyone that does that, I appreciate the conversations that we have. So, so you and I can talk about that, and when we want to have them on for that.
Yeah.
And then I think we also should have David on at some point.
David Lay?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's my buddy. I like David.
Yeah. So because of this format, I think it makes it more possible for us to have guests on that don't have to travel to the museum or to Nevada or whatever. So you and I can organize that. You and I can organize that because I think that would be a really lively conversation. It would take up the 2 hours of recording time we have.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
So
all right.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, you guys, and
hopefully we'll get some more out a little bit quicker. And yeah, take vitamins, go out in the sun. But if you're around people, wear a mask.
Wear a mask. Yeah.
Do what you can. Go vote. Please vote.
Please vote. Just and as someone who lived in Oregon for 6 years, mail-in voting is not rife with fraud. Oregon is one of those states that's been doing it for decades. At least to my knowledge, they've done it for at least a decade or more. And the military has been doing it for a very long time. So mail-in voting is okay. But if you're worried about it getting to to being counted on time, you can always go to a ballot drop-off and turn it in directly. So that's what I'm going to do. But yeah,
that's a great idea.
Anyway, so hopefully I'm going to process this right and not dump it right after we're done because I haven't done that yet. And with that, we're going to say goodbye until the next time.
Yeah. Oh, also we have Facebook.
Find us on Facebook too. Yes. I'll put all in the links in there. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Have a good night.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Peace.